The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is a very interesting game in the Zelda franchise. After the backlash from Wind Waker's cartoony art style, Nintendo, like new members in a frat, got peer pressured into making one of the darkest Zeldas to date. With its mature themes and Midna, surely there were some things we couldn't miss. After finishing up our last day of work, we get assaulted by a boblin. We wake up as a wolf, but after getting the rundown on what has happened from Midna and Zelda, we realize our true calling. Entering the Forest Temple. So after regaining our human form, we move on to the temple itself. With its windy atmosphere and clean design, let's hop into the Forest Temple to see what you couldn't miss. As we enter the first room of the Forest Temple, we come across 4 totem poles with various detailed carvings in each one. We see many more of these carvings throughout the temple, but never get a clue as to who made them and what they're for. While you can assume, since this is a temple, probably some ancient Hyruleans made these carvings. But the real answer is the monkeys, showing us that this monkey tribe has more than just intelligence, it has a culture. Deeper into the Forest Temple we come across tile worms. These enemies are smart and utilize the tiles located on the ground of the Forest Temple for camouflage. Not much is known about these creatures, however, due to their large worm-like appearance, we probably know more about these worms than we think. These worms must be the extremely far down the line descendants of twin mold, which, after being exposed to the elements, evolved to burrow into tiles as opposed to sand. The massive windy valley inside the Forest Temple is a very amazing sight to behold and one of the highlights of the Forest Temple. Here we need to utilize the Gale Boomerang to align these bridges for us to pass over the valley safely. However, these devices, while cool, are also very sophisticated. Clearly creating the wind switches would require an understanding of fluid mechanics when it comes to how air would flow around them. And with how sturdy they seem to be, this must mean the monkeys, on top of being culturally gifted, also have a deep understanding of physics and architecture, allowing them to create technology such as this. Now with the Gale Boomerang in our arsenal, we can start utilizing it to bring over small objects to our person. The main difference from other boomerangs, however, is the Gale's ability to bring bombs as well as other more heavy objects to Link. While this is an awesome feature, the fact this power was in the hands of the enemy is terrifying to imagine. Assuming that Diababa was in control of Ook, at any moment Diababa could have sent a bombing attack to anywhere in Hyrule at a moment's notice, which, on top of the state Hyrule is currently in, would be devastating. And finally, we make it to Diababa. This boss involves utilizing the Gale Boomerang and Ook's assistance to weaken Diababa to allow Link to get in close for heavy damage. However, while Diababa's main head just gets hit by the bombs, the other 2 heads for some reason swallow them, causing instant death. This at first wouldn't make sense, but considering Diababa regrows these heads, we can deduce why they do this. The reflex to swallow must be because the newly grown heads still have the rooting reflex, which is a reflex meant to help newborns successfully receive the nutrition they need. With the Forest Temple clear and the monkey tribe saved, we head to Kakariko Village, and after another quarrel with the Boblins, we hear the villagers' plight, and now know what we must do. 1. Become a sumo wrestler, and 2. Utilize that power to save the Gorons by clearing Goron Mines. Goron Mines is a very attractive dungeon for many reasons, but today, instead of glazing the dungeon, I'm going to tell you what you couldn't miss. As soon as we enter the Goron Mines, we understand why it was so heavily guarded in the first place. With lava and unstable ground everywhere, one wrong move and a human-like Link is toast. However, this fact alone perfectly explains why the Gorons were taught to test Link with sumo wrestling, making sure his footwork is as steady as his resolve prepares him for this harsh environment. The deeper into the Goron Mines we go, the more we get exposed to the most attractive feature of this dungeon, which is the magnet walls and machines we use to traverse this landscape. These magnets are very peculiar for one specific reason: Link's sword. For no reason whatsoever, Link's sword, which we can only assume to be steel or iron like his boots, is not attracted to these extremely strong magnets. This clearly means that Link can demagnetize objects he is currently touching, meaning the reason the boots are still magnetized is because either Link can control this power or is wearing socks to protect the boots from this power. The valley we come across in the Goron Mines is filled with Boblins and a firing squad line here specifically for Link's demise. And while they are easy enough to dispose of with the slingshot or the bow, the fact a whole other set of Boblins fills this area on our next visit is extremely shocking. This shows that the Boblins, other than working for Ganon, genuinely despise Link. meaning that the beef between Link and the Boblins is greater than any of us could imagine. For the mid-boss of the mines, we come across Dangoro, which is clearly not as docile as the Elder told us he would be. Luckily, Link is prepared for this fight due to the iron boots, his socks, and the magnetized floor, but why was Dangoro so adamant on attacking humans? This must mean that Dangoro has had a bad experience with humans before, and the only human we know of that would give Dangoro such an impression is Ganon, which means Dangoro has not only faced Ganon, but has lived to tell the tale. As we reach the boss room, we see Darbus chained up and controlled by the fused Shadow, taking on the name Fyrus. This fight is pretty simple due to Fyrus constantly showing off his weak spot with a glaring light shining off its head. Though even with its fatal flaw, Fyrus's flames seem to not be as hot as they look. This is seen clearly in him not being able to burn the arrows shot at him, and the chains not even deforming around his wrists. This must mean that Fyrus didn't warm up or prepare for this fight beforehand, showing us how laziness and ego can be anyone's downfall. With Darbus saved and the villagers satisfied, we journey to Lake Hylia. After unfreezing the river by gifting the Zoras a massive rock, we journey to Castletown at the behest of Rutella. Doing as she asked, we save her son, receiving the Zora armor in return. With this armor, we can now have safe passage to the Lakebed Temple. The Lakebed Temple, with its regal choral aesthetic, is just asking to be ignored. However, today, let's see what you couldn't miss. As soon as we entered the temple, we come across a group of stalactites. These rock formations are very odd if we compare them to their counterparts in the real world. What seems to be happening is that the surface tension and viscosity of water in the Zelda universe must be higher than what we see on Earth. This explains the funky stalactites we see in multiple Zelda games and why it is usually so hard to traverse water without outside assistance such as the Zora armor or the iron boots. Once we start getting this temple explored, we start to realize we need a source of water to open up many paths necessary to complete this dungeon. However, once we make it to the water source and achieve water flow, we notice it completely impedes the path we once took to reach it. This deterrent system must mean that during the time this temple was created, there was a Zora delinquency problem. This caused the Zora architects to create a system that wouldn't allow the water switch to be reached without the use of equipment such as the claw shot or the iron boots. However, years after the structure was abandoned, the Zora delinquents clearly made their way to this temple for a last act of defiance to turn off the flow, which is why we now need to turn it back on. Now that we got the gears turning on this dungeon, we can finally see how these ancient gears function and their purpose. Many of these machines seem to be used for traversal of the rooms we see in the water temple. However, this one specifically, with its 3 platforms in a triangular shape, clearly is foreshadowing the claw shot we will receive from the room it allows us to traverse to. While we attempt to acquire the claw shot, we run into the Deku Toad. This creature with its fat lip has a very odd tendency. This toad utilizes its newly born children, which are still in their tadpole phase of metamorphosis, as soldiers. This is extremely odd, and while we know toads usually do not tend to their young after they are born, they at least usually take care of where they are born, which makes this toad putting her children on a battlefield extremely odd. Maybe their lack of care for their children comes from the carbon they would emit if they were left to live, or maybe even just the cowardice of not wanting to fight Link alone. Well, whatever it may be, it is extremely terrifying to see such a lack of emotion from this creature. As we reach the boss room, we find the dungeon guardian Morpheal. Clearly this boss is a far down the line descendant of Morpha with many enhancements to its survivability. This species clearly has adapted since its last encounter with Link, with it gaining a whole eel-like body to allow movement as opposed to being liquid in a pool like Morpha was before. However, with a whole new body to control, clearly Morpheal has not fully grasped how to utilize its old appendages in unison with the new. This is seen when Link is attached to Morpheal and while clearly is in range of their tentacles, is never grabbed due to this gross incompetence. We cleared the Lakebed Temple and after getting ambushed by Zant, rushed to Zelda to save Midna from the curse Zant inflicted her with. Now, with Midna having new health, we utilize resistance contacts to make our way to the desert, and after embarrassing King Bulblin for a 3rd time, we make it to the Arbiter's grounds. The Arbiter's grounds has the spinner, and today I'm going to tell you what you couldn't miss. As soon as we enter the main sanctum of the Arbiter's grounds, we come across a group of 4 Poe spirits. Instantly, we can draw comparisons to the 4 Poe sisters we see in Ocarina of Time, and some may think a dark story like that of the Poe sisters would fit right inside of Twilight Princess's dynamic. However, the real story is even darker. If we think critically, we can assume 3 out of the 4 Poes are the bosses we killed along the way: Morpheal, Phyrus, and Diababa. However, since they wouldn't have a grudge against Link worth missing the afterlife for, they must have been kept from the afterlife by another one of Link's fallen enemies. One with a grudge that could rival even Zant or Ganondorf's. Of course, I am talking about the Scarecrow we brutally murdered and humiliated in front of the children of Ordon Village with our slingshot. With the constant theme of death, it's no wonder we come across many Gibdos, Stall Children, and Stallfoes in this dungeon. Clearly, these enemies are reanimated prisoners that used to reside in the grounds when they were still functional. However, what was their deep desire that allowed them to reanimate? We can assume with the shape of the Arbiter's grounds being similar to that of a Colosseum, that many fights were held with the prisoners that were lodged here. So clearly, the reanimated enemies we come across here were prisoners who lost in their first gladiator match and due to the humiliation, reanimated to hopefully redeem their shameful performance. Later into the Arbiter's grounds, we come across a massive gap that requires the use of the chandelier to cross. However, is utilizing the chandelier required? Unlike many other Zelda games, Link in Twilight Princess, with his sumo training and magnet floor reps, never skips leg day, and can just jump across gaps whenever necessary. One of the most memorable moments in the Arbiter's grounds is after we receive the spinner. Being able to fly and zip around the upcoming room is exhilarating and amazing to experience for the first time. However, the spinner unfortunately never sees its full potential. This is due simply to Link forgetting to light the furnace built into the spinner with his lantern, which would allow him to gain speed without the need for rails. The fight with Stalwart is a very cool fight. Going from attacking a spinal column in a pinball-like fashion into a high-speed chase is quite a fun dichotomy. However, even though the fight is great, that doesn't make Stalward's situation great. Stalwart was a great and powerful beast that died peacefully with no regrets, though with Zant's power, was forcefully reanimated by being stabbed in the face. This obviously hurt Stalwart, and without even needing to be controlled by Zant, assumed Link was the one who stabbed him and struck out in blind rage. If only Stalwart saw Zant, maybe he would have joined the resistance and helped Link fight the evils tormenting Hyrule. After dealing with Stalwart, we learned that the Mirror Twilight was shattered. However, since our last meeting with our resistance contacts, more info has been uncovered. So utilizing the info we gained from Ashe, we are able to track down Yeto the Yeti due to their choice in fish. Hearing of his wife's illness and their piece of the mirror, we make our way to Snowpeak Ruins. With ice physics and heavy artillery, there's a lot to cover in this dungeon, but today, let's see what you couldn't miss. As soon as we enter the Snowpeak Ruins, although under disrepair, it looks very lived in. This makes sense, especially considering this is the Yeti's family home. However, with all the monsters here, how do the Yetis safely get into their kitchen and living room? While you may think they're intimidating to the monsters, they're actually quite the opposite. The Yetis clearly tamed every single monster inside the ruins, and clearly, the reason they attack Link is because Yeto simply forgot to introduce you to them. Now onto the living room and the kitchen. This is where you meet Yetta, the sick Yeti, for the first time. She kindly points us in the right direction for finding the key to the bedroom of the estate. However, after we realize she was wrong, we go to get a correction. And while she does correct the location, she also somehow opens the bar door inside of her room. While this looks like telepathy to many, what's happening here is even more unbelievable. The anxiety spike Yetta has from embarrassment actually gives her ludicrous speed. This allowed her to run over to the other door and to open it faster than the eye could see. One of the reoccurring enemies in the dungeon are many Freezards. These little dudes are usually on icy surfaces practicing their figure skating, and when they see Link, they instantly get a desire to perform for him and start skating up to him. This would be fine if sadly the Freezards didn't have a genetic disposition to inflict frostbite to anyone they touch. This sadly causes Link to view them as threats and take them out accordingly. The mid-boss for Snowpeak Ruins is Darkhammer, one of the most intellectual bosses in Twilight Princess. He slowly walks towards Link with his ball and chain and never falters by throwing it at us unless 2 scenarios occur. Either Link uses the claw shot or gets hit by the swinging of the ball. This persistence of never leaving himself without a weapon unless Link takes a risk is extremely smart, and even compared to previous bosses we have faced, Darkhammer is the smartest. The final fight we have in this dungeon is weirdly enough with Yetta. After gazing into the mirror Twilight shard, she loses herself in the Twilight and starts to attack Link. And while this may be true somewhat, they've had this mirror in their bedroom for a while now and haven't been affected by it until now. This must mean that the soup Yeto used to make her feel better unfortunately had a weakening effect as well. This removed her natural resistance to the mirror and unfortunately made her lose control. With the Yeti saved from the meteor shard, we learn from our resistance contacts yet again of another point of interest. This leads us into the Lost Woods for the second time, and after chasing Skull Kid for the second time as well, we make it back to the resting place of the Master Sword for the second time. So after putting the Master Sword back into its pedestal and taking it out for the second time, we open the Temple of Time. This temple is intriguing and the second time we have entered it since Ocarina of Time, and today I'm going to show you what you couldn't miss. As soon as we enter the Temple of Time, we insert our Master Sword into the pedestal for the second time. This causes a staircase to spawn in front of us, and before we can react, we see Okoko running ahead of us. While this doesn't affect our future actions, the metaphor it brings upon us is profound. Clearly this was done to demonstrate that many have gone before us and helped pave the road Link travels to his destiny. Now that we have entered the depths of the Temple of Time, it's hard to ignore what we have just done. Clearly we have gone back in time. However, as opposed to Ocarina of Time, this time we keep our age. Obviously, the reason why we can tell this place is from a previous time is how well this temple is kept as opposed to every other one we have come across. However, since this temple is well kept, this temple must have workers that tend to it and keep it this way. This must mean that Link and the Gomas came into this temple after hours, trashed it, stole from it, and then left. And even if this temple was meant to be as a test for the hero, the work to prepare this temple for another hero after Link's destruction will take at least a month. The most interesting sight we see inside the temple is a bunch of baby Goma in a pen of some sort. What seems to be the case is Armagoma put a ton of her children in this area as some sort of daycare, which, if true, makes the mental image of Link waltzing into a daycare and killing all the baby Goma the most disturbing imagery ever seen in a Zelda game. After receiving the Dominion Rod, we now have authority and dominion over many of the statues in and out of the Temple of Time. The ability to control these statues using our own movement is a very disorienting experience. However, the truly disorienting fact is what the statues are actually doing. When Link uses the Dominion Rod, despite what it looks like, we are not actually taking control of the statues. What we are doing is simply giving them life, and the illusion of control we feel is actually a ploy by the statues. The statues are actually mentally children and take extreme joy in mimicking others. Thus, after being awakened, instantly start mimicking the first person they see to mock them, unfortunately meaning that they have no respect for the hero of Twilight whatsoever. The mid-boss in the Temple of Time is the Dark Nut, and while nowhere near as smart as Darkhammer from the previous dungeon, Dark Nut is even more talented. Not requiring a gimmick to match Link in a sword duel proves that enough, but even after Link quickly dispatches of his armor, the Dark Nut quickly takes a new stance to compensate for his lack of protection. This skill we see is honestly more than any simple mid-boss in the dungeons of this game could ever have or achieve. Thus, this must mean that this mid-boss is actually the game's Phantom Ganon, which perfectly explains the skill level we see in this enemy. The final battle with Armagoma is an excellent use of the Dominion Rod and allows us to visualize how strong the statues in this dungeon actually are. However, after the first phase of the fight, we quickly see the true colors of Armagoma and the reason it has armor in its name. The tiny creature that emerges is pitiful and quite a funny finale to this already amazing dungeon. Though, how does a spider where 75% of its body is an eye lay eggs nearly 50% of its body mass? Well, at first, this was confusing, but the assumption that made the most sense to me was Armagoma just puts more effort into these things than others do, showing her immense commitment to the grind. After clearing the Temple of Time for the first time, we now have the Dominion Rod. However, due to age, we need to revitalize it. So after getting intel from Impaz, we can now use the rod to move owl statues. These statues hold even more intel and allow us to find the key to the Sky Cannon. And finally, after one last stop at Fire's shop for repairs, we make it to the City in the Sky. With its heavenly and Okoko aesthetic, this is what you couldn't miss. As soon as we land in the City in the Sky, we discuss with a few Okos about a shop near the start of the entrance to the city. After entering and browsing its wares, weirdly enough the Okos keep in stock human-sized proportions of their items. This can mean one of two things. Either Okos love to buy items in bulk, or the more likely option, due to the massive arrows they sell, being that they have a human customer base that avidly buys from their shop. But, since the shop is so far up in the sky, who could possibly keep the shop in business? Taking into consideration all the characters we have come into contact with so far, the only one that could be a customer here is the Postman. This is due to his innate ability to teleport to Link anytime he runs across a bridge. Considering this dungeon is called City in the Sky, it only makes sense that we would find many Okos other than the shopkeeper and our old friend. Though, other than those two, no other Oko speak Hylian. This shows us how different Oko culture is compared to Link's, and how being in the sky has preserved it. One of the main features in this dungeon are the falling floors. These blue blocks, when not respected, usually end in Link taking a deadly fall back to Earth. However, due to Link's deep respect of the blocks and their danger, he side hops to touch them minimally, thus causing the blocks to respect him in return and allow him to pass. With the constant updrafts we see in the dungeon, it's no wonder the game wants us to utilize Okos to glide over many of the gaps it presents us with. However, while most Okos are walking on the ground, many seem to defy gravity and walk on walls as if nothing odd is occurring. This actually tells us that Okos have crazy strong talon strength and can grip onto walls with ease. After defeating the Arialfos, we obtain the claw shot for the second time. This allows us to grapple from wall to wall without having to fall on the ground to reset. This movement option, while great, is also extremely odd. This item is the only one that takes functionality away from Link, not allowing him to utilize just one claw shot past this point. This, while many will write off as not a big deal since they are functionally the same, is a tragedy, because taking away items the player earned is never okay. During this entire dungeon, we have been utilizing these egg-shaped switches to activate many mechanisms throughout the dungeon. These switches, while we have been utilizing them, clearly are meant for the Okokos and their society to function. This makes it extremely odd that the larger eggs require the iron boots to be fully activated. With so much weight required to activate them, how do the Okos activate them without outside assistance? While we already discussed how Okos have amazing grip strength, clearly they would have to utilize this strength in tandem with an ability to change their mass at will, thus allowing them to pull these weight-actuated eggs with ease. The boss of the city is Argorok. This boss in its first phase is very reminiscent of the fight with Goma in the Wind Waker, while also mixing in the fight with Morpheal in its second phase. These two weaknesses of Argorok end with their demise and leave us in a very sunny and grassy field. By the looks of it, this must be the Oko's agricultural center where they plant and harvest grass that they either turn into hay or eat for a balanced diet. However, unfortunately, as we all know, Link has a deep ingrained hatred for grass, and slowly goes around cutting every last inch of the field to satiate this hatred. This unfortunately means that shortly after Link leaves the city, the Okos have to deal with a food shortage for the next few months. The Mirror Twilight shards are all in one place, and with the Mirror Twilight restored, we find ourselves on the Palace of Twilight's grounds. This dungeon with its Twilight aesthetic is a perfect way to show us the Twilight Realm for the first time, and today, I'm going to show you what you couldn't miss. In the palace courtyard, we come across many of the Twilight people. However, clearly many are cursed and have their faces covered like the shadow beasts we have come across through the entire game. This leaves us with a question. What is the mask that is imparted onto these poor Twilight, and what is the symbolism behind it? If we look closely, the middle looks like an eye on top of a sun that is shining outwards. This symbolism represents blindness to what Zant is forcing them to do, because if you look at the sun, you will become blind. Though, with the other symbol being weird worms in a horseshoe shape, this meaning is more easy to miss. This symbol clearly symbolizes Zant's love of fishing and riding horses. Before we even know this dungeon's main gimmick, we have to deal with Phantom Zant. Phantom Zant, comparatively to many other mid-bosses, is quite a coward. He spends most of the fight attempting to summon minions to attack for him, and all of his attacks he personally will make are all ranged. Though, despite what it looks like, is it really cowardice? What seems to be the case is Phantom Zant isn't actually a phantom and more like a hologram, teleporting constantly and keeping his distance in an attempt to hide this fact from Link. This is to keep the intimidation factor that comes from being perceived as a phantom. To make our way to the center of the palace, we need to collect soul balls, and while moving small objects is Link's specialty, Link has never had to guard them against Zant's massive hand. Zant's hand during this section ruthlessly hunts down the soul ball, mainly in hopes of keeping it from Link, but also is done for pure enjoyment. If you didn't know, Zant loves the defensive side of many sports. No matter the sport, if it involves taking the other team's balls away from them, Zant is hooked. This explains why Zant allows the ball to be taken at first, so he can enjoy the thrill of chasing Link and the soul ball with his hand. After gaining the power to slice through darkness from the soul balls, we make it to the central sanctum. Though the deeper we dive, the more disembodied masks of Zant we see across the entire palace. These enemies actually have a lot more lore than many originally thought. Before Zant was evil, he proposed to the royal Twilight family, including Midna, a design he had for the mascot of the royal family, and as we can suspect, this design clearly got rejected due to its weird composition, and while this isn't the main reason, Zant's embarrassment and sadness due to this design being rejected definitely contributed to his downfall into evil. The final fight with Zant is extremely fun to experience. We are transported through many boss locations we have visited before and have to utilize what items we received at each location to open Zant up to attack. However, this cycle of changing locations is not the only thing that changes. If we pay close attention to Zant, every time we go to a new area, he seems to get more desperate with his attacks, going so far as with the last phase to just flail at Link and hope his flurry will deter us. This sadly shows the deterioration of Zant in his final moments, and in a way shows his regret for allowing himself to be used and left to rot by Ganondorf. Zant has been popped like a balloon by Midna, but his words still remain. We now know that Ganondorf has been pulling the strings this whole time and was revived. So with Midna's ancestors' power, we reach Hyrule Castle and shatter the barrier. And now with nothing blocking our path into the castle, let's see what you couldn't miss one last time. As we enter the castle courtyard, it is looking very gloomy and is teeming with enemies everywhere. Seeing the front door locked, we understand that we need to fight our way through the courtyard to get the key. However, weirdly enough, anytime we attempt to fight a small group of enemies, we get trapped in a circle and are attacked by an onslaught of enemies. While many will assume this is Ganon's power in trapping Link, this circle is actually created by Link, who decides to not let any enemies escape to keep Castletown safe in case they would flee to it. Many entrapment circles later, we finally make it to the location of the key, but unfortunately, it is guarded by our rival, King Boblin. Just as we have done before, we defeat him again in battle, but this time he gives us parting words. He tells us he only follows the strongest side, and that it's all he's ever known. And while many will just assume he means Link has now surpassed Ganondorf in strength, clearly this is not the case, because if he considered Link the strongest, he would follow him instead of leaving after the battle. What must have happened is while fighting Link, King Boblin felt an aura stronger than Link or Ganondorf in a land other than Hyrule, causing him to go on a journey to find that aura so he can continue his ideology of following the strongest. As soon as we get inside the main sanctum of Hyrule Castle, we notice a distinct lack of methods to enter many rooms of the castle, only a tiny little platform with stairs and nothing else. This is fine for Link as he is able to grapple from chandelier to chandelier, but how would the Hyrulean family utilize this room? One theory is that this room was just used to hold meetings with the nobles and was never intended to be the entrance for the family. But the more likely scenario is the royal family are all proficient in utilizing the claw shot, and as soon as they learn to walk, they also utilize the claw shot to access their castle. After clearing the lower castle, we exit and are attempting to find the key to make it into the upper tower until we get ambushed. Surely Link would have died here, but luckily we have the resistance rush in for the save at the last moment. However, did the resistance really just get here? It seems almost too convenient that they would have saved Link at the last moment like they seem to do. What must have happened is the resistance knew these enemies were planning to ambush Link and wanted to capitalize on it to make themselves look better for the hero of Twilight. They did this by saving him at the last moment, and while it's understandable they want Link to see them as indispensable, if they made one wrong move, Link would have been toast. As we enter Hyrule Tower, we are instantly attacked by phantom rats, but more importantly, as we remove the rats, we see spirits of the soldiers pointing us to the correct path to continue up the tower. While lower in the castle we saw similar soldiers pointing us towards switches, having a group of them working towards one goal must mean that they have a leader. The identity of this leader is hard to pinpoint, but if you think back to what we have seen earlier in the game, it must be Rutella, as she is the only spirit we have seen in the past with a connection to the royal family. Right past the group of soldiers, we come face to face with a pit in place of a staircase. While the castle being in disrepair isn't surprising, the fact that this pit is bottomless definitely is, especially considering it's directly above the main sanctum we traversed minutes prior. The way this pit works logically, unfortunately, is a terrifying thing to realize. This pit must be the doing of Ganondorf utilizing the power he learned from Zant to create a bottomless pit, making Ganondorf more formidable than any of us originally thought. As we finally make it to the top of Hyrule Tower, we finally catch up with Ganon, but before we are able to fight him, he decides to puppeteer Zelda, forcing Link to fight against her. This is a good strategy for Ganon to employ, but definitely not the most moral, However, what's odd about this fight is that as opposed to the puppet Ganon fight in the Wind Waker, Zelda is on no strings. So this brings up the question, how is Zelda being controlled? With the movements Zelda is making being almost one-to-one with the ones Ganon would make if he was attacking us with his Phantom, this must mean that Ganon is using his own body movements to control Zelda, and the only place he could do this and see the battle would be from one of the windows on the roof, meaning odds are some people in Castletown are seeing what they would only assume is to be a madman on top of Hyrule Castle making extremely odd movements. After Zelda is rescued, Ganon's only ploy to stay out of the fight is lost, which leads us to the first phase of the fight. As it starts, Ganondorf seems to harness the same power Link uses to turn into Wolf Link to transform into Beast Ganon. Though, when this transformation occurs for Ganon, it's clear that Ganon's anger is amplified and his mind goes cloudy. This is seen by him not attempting to hide his glaring weak spot, and in how Ganon will rush Link down with only a single plan constantly until Link finally shoots some sense into him, causing him to start the dodge. Though, with this analysis, clearly the most affected part of Ganon by transforming into this form was his IQ. After Ganon realizes the downsides of being in beast form after getting suplexed by Midna, he decides to ride on a beast instead of becoming one. This phase of the fight involves chasing down Ganondorf or getting chased by Ganondorf, all while attempting to give Zelda a good shot with her light arrows. However, weirdly enough, when Ganondorf lands a good enough blow onto Link to knock him off Epona, instead of finishing the job, he decides to stop and stare at Link. This is odd, especially considering how ruthless Ganondorf was towards Midna right before the phase began. The only thing I can imagine Ganon freezing for is the one fear every man has, the fear of realizing one's fly is down. Clearly Ganon noticed that his was down during the whole horse riding segment and froze in horror. With no more tricks up his sleeve, Ganondorf decides to finally face Link in one-on-one combat, and with Link utilizing his entrapment circle, there's no way Ganondorf is going to change tactics for the 5th time. This fight shows that Ganondorf's skills in combat are amazing and honestly the most formidable aspect about him so far. However, the most menacing factor of all is the fact that Ganondorf is utilizing the sword he was previously impaled with. This detail, however, no matter how cool it is also Ganondorf's undoing. The name of this sword is the Sword of the Six Sages, and clearly shares its look with the sages from its namesake. If this sword was created with the purpose to specifically seal Ganondorf in a similar vein to the Master Sword, why would this sword ever be okay with being utilized by Ganondorf? The sword in defiance to the one it desires to seal clearly slowly was sucking the power out of Ganondorf the whole fight, and by the time Ganon realizes this fact, it's too late. And that is the end of Twilight Princess, what you couldn't have missed. If you enjoyed, do what feels right for you.